plane in DC and go to get a cab, I get handed a notice that tells me what the fare rates are for the cabs that operate in the DC metro area. And every week I read the same notice, and I have just stopped taking the notice. I feel the same way when I go get medical care and I receive the HIPAA privacy notice. And after a while, the original intent of the regulation to put consumers of health service on notice of what their rights are loses its impact because it gets lost in the huge volume of paperwork that healthcare providers face every day. What are some of the frustrations you hear from your colleagues about not just the intent of the regulation, but the burden of complying with the regulation and how that impacts the ability to provide patient care?
Many of the patients that we see are sick, and they don't want to have to deal with stuff. They just want to be taken care of. So that's the biggest issue for them is, you know, I don't want this. I don't want to hear. I don't want the paperwork. They see it over and over. You're right. They don't read it. They take it. We put it in their folder. We tell them, you have to have this. We must do this. So that's the biggest frustration. They don't read it. I didn't speak to HIPAA today and how it affects us. We have lots of other things. And we redo the forms every 60 days. So it's not a once a year thing. I mean, the 15-page assessment is every 60 days. It's a dilemma.
Dr. Cheek, one of the things that I mentioned earlier was the federal plain language guidelines. And you alluded to this in your opening remarks, but one of the things that you hear from people who are opposed to making change in the way agencies do their business is a lot of myths and misperceptions about what plain language guidelines will actually require. You made it very clear that the number one rule is to make sure you're writing for your intended audience. And also that the burden of making sure that that communication is clear is the writers, not the readers. That makes a lot of sense. What are some of the misconceptions that you have encountered that have been disproven by agencies and organizations that have implemented these types of guidelines in their everyday work?
Right. Well, having worked in 4 different federal agencies, I think I've heard them all. This material is too technical. That's a very common one. We have a great piece of evidence about that. The Johnson Space Flight Center redid their manual for contractors in a very plain style, and it covers very complex material about cryogenics and so on. And it's a wonderful model of how you can indeed take technical language and make it clear. And in fact, I think the more complex the original, the bigger the burden you have to make it clear. And then there's one that I heard from an attorney in the White House who deals with executive orders. I was trying to get them to make a commitment to plain language executive orders. They, of course, thought I was from outer space. And his comment was, no, we can't use language like that. It's not magisterial. That sort of set me back. I didn't think we had a monarchy anymore, but apparently we do. And then, of course, from the attorneys, it's not precise. There are a lot of examples showing that, indeed, it is more precise than bureaucratic language because it is clear and direct. That about covers the waterfront. And I don't think there is any case that we've seen that we haven't been able to show that a plain language version is superior.
Going back to your Johnson.
Was.
Mr. Hall and Mr. McCracken, as an attorney practicing in Iowa for 24 years, I represented a lot of small business owners. And one of the things that always struck me was when I represented clients who had employees with commercial driver's licenses and were therefore subject to mandatory drug and alcohol testing, and there would be very complex, precise regulations about what needed to be in internal policy manuals in order to comply with the regulation. And when my clients would bring these problems to me, I would just say to them, well, isn't there some sort of example that the agency has published which is a template for how you comply with this requirement? And they would say, no. And so then they would hire me to draft a personnel manual for them to comply with these regulations, and it seemed like an incredible waste of time to know that this was being replicated in small businesses all over the country. what types of experiences do your members talk about in terms of the financial burden of complying with complex, difficult information that they're getting from federal agencies?
As we visit with small business, micro business owners across the country, most of what we talk about is taxes, IRS. They still go back to the confusion on the forms themselves. Again, back to whether or not the information is in plain language. A vast majority of micro business owners know the rules. They know, back to my example, they know if they've bought a computer that there is a tax deduction for that. But when they sit down at the kitchen table to try to go through the forms, and the IRS form says they can expect to spend 47 hours completing that form, they lose track of the plain language that they're hoping is there to what's actually on those forms. They know the information, they know the computer's deductible, but they just lose sight of how to translate that to the form. And I think that's the main benefit that an emphasis on plain language can help with those tax forms.
And before you answer, Mr. McCracken, it seems to me that a lot of these commercial software applications for tax preparation adopt the approach of working in a very simple progression to help people answer questions without having a long, detailed instruction sheet, which seems to get to the same point in a different way.
I think that's exactly right, but again, what they're doing now is trading their own headaches and the cost of Advil at the kitchen table versus having to buy the software package or having to pay a tax professional to do the return. Either way, they're still out the financial resources.
Exactly. Mr. McCracken?
Yeah, I think you've really hit the nail on the head, and that is, I mean, you've given a specific example that relates to one type of business, but the reality is there are examples just like that for every industry, whether you're a metal finisher or you're trying to run a 401k plan for your employees. No matter what it is, there are examples where the company, not only do they have to turn to an attorney or a benefit administrator or some professional they have to pay, not only to interpret the laws, but also to, as you say, to give them that security they need, even once they have adopted the law, to make sure they're continuing to do it correctly. I mean, and that's, I think it's hard to overstate the burden that places on companies, because usually not only are they paying for professional help, they are, before they get to that point, struggling on their own to see if they can figure out what it is they're supposed to do, and they are left often with a sense that they think they know what they're supposed to do, maybe, but they aren't sure. And that's when you're trying to run a business and you have a multitude of many things in your business environment with your employees that are full of uncertainty, to layer on top of that what ought to be clear rules for them to follow are a whole new layer of uncertainty. And so they wind up doing a myriad of things. Sometimes they hire professionals to tell them what to do and pay a great deal of money for it. Sometimes they, as an example that I think Dr. Sheik mentioned before, they put it off. They think, well, I'll figure this one out later. And they may fall into noncompliance. And sometimes they just do the wrong thing because they take their own best guess and it's wrong. So it may seem like to some folks that this is a relatively insignificant issue, but I'm here to say from a small business perspective, it's an enormous issue. And if the federal bureaucracy can get this one right, they will have done an enormous service to the small business community.
Thank you. Mr. Ramasco, one of the things